It is truly, truly, truly an honor, a great blessing to be here with you this morning. I did not know when I received your phone call, Dr. Wilson. I didn't know what you were getting us into because my family is here. I try to drag my family everywhere because I have a 14-year-old, and we got to get these babies out and in the world, right? And experiencing things and getting exposure and whatnot. So I do. I drag her along. God bless her. And my husband, who is amazing, always comes along too, and we do a lot of beautiful things together. But I didn't know what we were getting into. And I can say that my soul has been fed, and I am just so grateful. And my goodness, this is only the beginning of the second day. And the power that I have felt and just the refreshing of my soul, I just can't thank God enough for that. So it's truly a joy to be here with you. And so when you called that day and invited me to discuss my work in Black maternal health and also Black maternal mental health, I was really excited because, as we all know, that the well-being of our children is impacted not only by our education systems, by our neighborhoods, right, our food systems, right, it's all interconnected, but also by the family. And those earliest years, which include mama's health, right? For instance, that prenatal care and maternal mental health, something that we actually don't talk about that a whole lot, right? So in my time with you this morning, as we examine the connection between theological ethics, sacred memory, and collective resistance, I want to begin with just a few questions from two sisters who really informed my research and even the book that my dear brother here has mentioned. Dr. Charla Fett and Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens work on this connection between slavery and maternal and infant health. And they ask a few really important questions. First, they ask, how does a community learn to trust doctors whose forefathers were only interested in repairing and restoring Black women's reproductive health so that slavery could be perpetuated? And then secondly, they ask, how can doctors be more sensitive to the concerns, both personal and cultural, of Black, Latina, and Indigenous, and Native American and Pacific Islander people who still hold communal memory about forced sterilizations, among other things? And then thirdly, they ask, how does the medical profession unlearn the patterns of dismissing Black women's self-reported pain and ignore Latina and Indigenous women's humanity when these patterns are rooted in century-old soil? We are indeed haunted by our racial past. And y'all all know the adage, the past is not dead. It's not even past. That's one of the reasons why we are here together today, is it not? So my work and my research is particularly grounded in a womanist theological ethics framework. And this, of course, womanism is a response to mainstream theology's neglect of the lived experience of black women and other women of color, an experience that is characterized by this interaction of race, gender, and class. And a good deal of my work and research entails doing excavation, right? Uncovering and recovering of narratives that have fallen on the margins of history because of this perilous connection that exists between identity, social status, and health in this country. In fact, the impetus, not the only one, but a big impetus for me writing Womanist Bioethics, Social Justice, Spirituality, and Black Women's Health is the fact that I was born merely 10 years after the desegregation of hospitals. That is something we don't talk about a lot, right? We talk about desegregation of our education system, of other public facilities, but we do not talk about all of the carnage that was left behind because of the segregation of hospitals. So I grew up hearing horror stories about family and community folks suffering in the healthcare system in this nation. Stories about feeling unheard, unseen, uncared for in institutions that prioritized cure, but where care was lacking because of the convergence of race and health, which still is a deadly combination. And so the reason that womanism is important in my work is not only because it helps to center these stories that have fallen by the wayside and these experiences that are considered often marginal, but also because it makes clear that in order for us to get an adequate understanding of what justice means in human relations, it requires that we start with the needs of those most vulnerable among us. Being mindful, though, that vulnerability is created. You know, often we think about vulnerability and we think about, folks who we consider vulnerable as being deficient in some way, right? Weak or something like that. But no. Vulnerability is actually created through power imbalances, historical relations within society and institutional structures and policies that advantage some while disadvantaging others. So by listening to those who are vulnerable, we can get a fuller sense of what concepts like child of God, dignity, respect, and even neighbor love mean. And so in my book, I demonstrate that to prioritize the perspective of vulnerable individuals for the sake of the common good does not devalue the gifts of those who don't consider themselves as vulnerable, but it actually acknowledges the necessity of the gift of solidarity. And so through my work, I provide a window into the world of individuals who find themselves contending with their vulnerability in the healthcare, economic, and religious institutions in this country. My research is actually a response to the health crisis among Black women in this country who are an understudied population in healthcare, disproportionately lack access to quality care, half of whom age 20 or older have hypertension, and for whom heart disease is the leading cause of death. Black women are also 2 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related complications. So it is important to me that I try to open up spaces for conversations about how race, gender, health, and spirituality are important considerations in health disparities. And one of the most important questions at the heart of my work is, as pastors, chaplains, theologians, advocates, and activists, as just folk who care about the flourishing of humanity, how should we show up in the world and in our work such that what we do becomes transformative for the most vulnerable among us? In my book, I provide a few guideposts for that, so I won't belabor that here. But in my work, in order to try to do this, bring together this bioethics and theology when analyzing this connection between race, health, and spirituality. Because bioethics is a study of these moral dilemmas that arise in healthcare, science, and technology. And it's a field that has a role in helping to train our leaders and practitioners within healthcare and research institutions, right? It can exert influence on policy generation and national policy agendas, helps us shape the prioritization of research funding. So in other words, like, who gets studied and what problems are prioritized in these research institutions. Indeed, the field of bioethics can also have an influence on our public opinions and public action, not just with respect to biomedicine and biotechnology, right? When the beginning of life and end of life issues, not just that, but these issues of access to care, equity, justice. And so the historical and the cultural realities of Black, immigrant, indigenous women and their children are critical lens through which to analyze these bioethical dilemmas and issues within this country. Because the lives of women and children testify to the current state of health care. And by centering the narratives of women and children, we can do this kind of interpretive work through their lives with the goal of achieving justice for all people. So because the lives of Black women and children interpret and critique the current state of healthcare, lament is central to my work. It is important that I center the stories of sisters like Amber Rose Isaac. Y'all mind if I do a little roll call? Amber died of preventable complications after a cesarean section at a hospital in the Bronx. Her partner said, and I quote, "All of this was 100% preventable, all of it. I feel like if she were a white mother, she would have gotten more attentive care," end quote. And then on to our sister, Chamonix Gibson, who died from preventable complications at the age of 30 following the birth of her second child. She repeatedly informed her doctors of her complications, and her partner claimed that they just didn't listen. They did not take her complaints seriously. And Maria Corona, our sister who wanted to remain in the hospital longer after the birth of her child, but her insurance would not pay for a longer stay. She died after giving birth. And we would think that while poverty, because poverty, is linked to suboptimal health outcomes and higher social status and education and employment, of course, we think those protect us from situations like the maternal health crisis, but they actually do not protect Black women from perishing in our nation's Black maternal health crisis. So the deaths of our dear sister, Dr. Shalon Irvin and Dr. Shanice Wallace, attest to this very fact. Dr. Irvin was an epidemiologist with good health insurance and a solid support system. And Dr. Wallace was a pediatrician who died from preeclampsia complications just days after giving birth. And lastly, in our moment of lament, I just want us to take a minute to remember our dear sister, Kira Johnson. Kira is important because of the legislation that came about after her death. She died after succumbing to fatal complications during what was a routine cesarean section in the spring of 2016. She gave birth, and her husband alerted the hospital staff that he noticed blood in her catheter. And their slow response to his admonition was costly. She bled internally for 10 hours before the staff addressed the bleeding. And from the records of the subsequent deposition, there were claims by clinicians at that hospital who attested to witnessing differential treatment of Black women patients. Indeed, Kira's widower contends that his wife would have survived had she been white. Kira's story, together with Congresswoman Alma Adams' daughter, who suffered, of course, near fatal complications after giving birth because, and I quote, doctors wouldn't listen. Combined with the dismal statistics of Black maternal mortality and morbidity, these things will become the catalyst for Adams and Congresswoman Lauren Underwood to launch the Black Maternal Health Caucus in 2019. Of course, the aim of the caucus was to improve Black maternal health outcomes. Now, among the issues in maternal health in this nation, as I said earlier, one that we do not often talk about is maternal mental health. Maternal mental health is a global issue that often goes unnoticed in our communities and our congregations. And it is experienced acutely, particularly among minoritized women in the US, for instance, African American and Native American indigenous women who suffer the highest rates of maternal mental health conditions. Within the year following birth, depression is one of the most common morbidities globally that women experience. And virtually all women can develop mental disorders during pregnancy and in that first year after delivery. But poverty, migration, extreme stress, exposure to violence, natural disasters, and low social support generally all increase the risk for specific maternal mental health disorders. And within the U.S., upwards of 40% of African American mothers face maternal mental health conditions. And American Indian Indigenous women experience postpartum depression at a rate double that reported by their white counterparts. So maternal mental illness has an impact, a negative impact, not only on maternal functioning, but it adversely impacts the development of infants and children. And the evidence indicates that treating the depression of mothers leads to improved growth and development of the newborn. So I'm asking you today, as you go back to your communities, go back to your congregations, to do some work of shining light on this little talked about issue of maternal mental health, but particularly mental health in general. At my congregation, I serve as co-director of the Health and Wellness Ministry, and we have made it a priority. We've had to make a priority in our ministry, mental health in general. It is very serious, and our leadership at the church came to us and they said, we are not equipped to deal with this. We need help. So we got to work, and we rallied the troops. We rallied folk in. First, you got to do an assessment in your congregation to see who's sitting in those pews, right? Because a lot of times we don't even know who we have sitting with us. And we did an assessment, and we had a meeting. We had a call meeting with mental health care professionals, and it was astounding how many folk we had in the pews who could help us take care of folk. So that's a first start. And then there's mental health first aid training that can be done for the leadership as well as folk in the congregation. I mean, I can just go on and on, but I just challenge you that when you go back to your respective spaces, to please do what you can to help address this issue broadly, right? Maternally, but even broadly in our communities, and particularly with our babies, our youth. So yes, churches have a role in addressing this stigma that is associated with mental illness and the suffering and disability that accompany maternal mental illness. And I want to just note that it's really important to remember, as we all, we consider ourselves pretty cosmopolitan society. A lot of us are probably in more urban spaces or suburban spaces, but remember, please, our rural community. Remember the folk out in the country. Because these issues are exacerbated in rural communities. In rural communities, maternal mortality is higher. Women often have to travel 1 hour or more to deliver a baby. And if a hospital is facing budget challenges, often the first unit to be cut is the obstetrical ward. And further, rural hospitals, which are about 35% of all hospitals in this nation, are, in some instances, economic drivers in their communities where they're located. And we have had about 136 rural hospital closings from 2010 to 2021. And that may not sound like a lot, but almost 20 of those were in the year 2020 itself. And y'all remember that year. That was when we needed them the most. So I just want to acknowledge that it is utterly exhausting to live in a society that keeps making it clear through institutions, policies, and practices that Black and other minoritized lives are not worthy, respected, loved, and cared for. In short, that our lives just don't matter. This is my moment of saying, I see you. Amid the exhaustion and the chaos that we are living through in this moment, we must turn to our spiritual inheritance. The wisdom and the legacies of our ancestors. Because our advocacy and our activism needs to be grounded in this powerful spiritual inheritance from ancestors like our dear sisters Shifra and Pua, the Hebrew midwives. Our foremothers of liberation. See, the biblical narrative of these women tells their story of being subject to a ruler of Egypt who was driven by fear and intimidated by anything that posed a threat to his power. And he was concerned that the population of the Hebrews had grown too large. He's threatened, and so he orders the midwives to kill the infant sons. But these women defied the king. See, that's our spiritual inheritance, right? Of women who defy the death-dealing mandates of the state. And in addition to accompanying women in childbirth, I want us to remember that these women didn't just deliver babies, because that's significant in and of itself. But among the tasks of these midwives in the ancient Near East was their spiritual and healing roles. See, they comforted the mother, but they also performed rituals for spiritual protection over the mother and the infant. These were sacred acts. So the embodied wisdom of the midwives in Exodus comes together with their faith in God to bring forth new life into the world, much like your embodied practices of activism and advocacy. And the text tells us that because the midwives feared God, they didn't do what that old king of Egypt told them to do. They had more sense than that. And you know, we often talk about these midwives in passing as if they were nothing more than women who disobeyed the king of Egypt. But see, history proves that they were more than that. See, these women are ancient keepers of wisdom, our ancestral abuelitas, our grandmothers who carried medicine in their hands. And they are the women who love God. And their faith was lived out through their roles as spiritual healers and co-creators of new life. This faith prompted them to engage in civil disobedience, to enact justice, not unlike many courageous women throughout history. Y'all know them. I don't have to do another roll call. Harriet, Sojourner, y'all know them. But also not unlike the work that you are doing. Your advocacy, your activism. We don't take that for granted. This is our sacred inheritance. So this injustice that we see around us daily, that, we are tempted to, yes, it makes us weary, yes. It is working against the force of life, of love of God. And the hate and the fear and the ignorance, we got to remember, cannot be overcome by, or can be, it is definitely overcome by love and life and justice. That's why we're here. The power of God is on our side. We have a great inheritance to live into. Although we have this great spiritual inheritance, medicine and the healing that is in our hands, we too need to be healed. Yes, we are walking wounded healers. We carry generational, cultural, and personal trauma in our bodies. We are weighed down, some of us by regret, some by guilt, some by shame, abuse. As we work for social justice, we, maybe not on the outside, but on the inside, are hobbling from past pains, continued assaults on our personhood. So while we are focused on advocacy, activism, we cannot forget about taking a pause for our own healing. It is okay. It is actually a part of your call to pause for personal healing, to give ourselves that space to deal with our personal pasts and that haunt us. Some of us are struggling with assaults on our mental, our spiritual, and even our physical health. We just need space. We need to make room for that healing. Because God is not a cruel taskmaster, but a mother who loves us beyond what our limited minds can grasp. So yes, we are called to work, right? We got to put our hands to the plow, but we are also called to rest. We are called to rest. Rest in this divine love that is limitless. So I'm giving you permission today. I know you don't need it, especially not from me, because who am I? But I just want to give you permission, because sometimes, in my life, there have been people in my life, mentors, even some of my pastors who, just gave me permission to do something, right? And sometimes you just need to hear it a few times before it really sinks down good in your spirit. So I'm going to say it now. Rest, wounded healers. Rest. So my hope for us today, as I close, my hope is that in this culture of hurry and grind and exhaustion, that we can become a community of rest through this practice of Sabbath spirituality. And this Sabbath spirituality is something that I am still practicing. I'm trying to practice daily. It is cultivating this disposition of intentionality about our restfulness and be mindfulness, right? And so amid the distraction and even the escapism, I am praying for you that can also become a community of communion with God through prayer and meditation. And amid this rampant individualism and superficiality that we are swimming in this culture, pray that we can become a community of love and depth through the practice of connection and hospitality. So, as you all know, the work is great. And being prepared and ready definitely includes this rest. Rest, weary travelers. Please rest. God bless you.
We have just a brief amount of time for questions and conversation with Dr. Wilson. Please come to the microphones if you have questions.
Good morning.
I just want to let you know that your comments were so on point. I'm Josephine Robinson. I'm from Chicago, and I have a group in Chicago, and we've been looking at this issue. And I'm looking forward to, and if you're ever in the Chicago area, please let us know. I just, it resonated so much with me. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing and the work that you're inspiring us all to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for, it had so much meaning for me. As a pastor, I spent a lot of time in emergency rooms with Black women. And before I left home, I was in an emergency room with a Black woman who had been stabbed by her daughter who had mental illness. And so the family showed up really strong. And one of the things that I've recognized in emergency, in particular, is how Black women are neglected and Black families are neglected because of the built-in systemic bias. And I wondered about, is there a strategy that you would offer for advocacy for Black families that show up? Like, this family spent and were made to sit for 4 hours and not allowed to even go back and sit with a 72-year-old woman who was by herself, and the excuses kept changing, and it was just ridiculous. You know, it was, we got to have the same 5 people on the list to visit, and they said, well, the 4 people left. Well, you know, that's really our policy. Your policy is to put invisible people on a list who are gone? Like, really? And then it became, you know, something else, like, well, we'll see. And then it became, you know what, it's now change a shift, and so now there's another social worker who's going to come. It was just maddening, and my question is, in your work, have you found out, because it's not always clear, you know, what the steps of authority and how to reach people who can be decision makers around changing that behavior?
Yes.
So that's my question.
Thank you so much. Yes, so one of the things that, that I have in my work with communities, one of the things that we have talked about is that very issue of, you know, what do we do? What can folk do, right? When you, especially when you have to go and be in the healthcare system. And so one of the things that we do recommend is having a healthcare advocate. It's really important if you can. It doesn't have to be a formal, you know, relationship. It doesn't have to be someone like a social worker or someone in the medical system. It can be your sister, your brother, just a cousin, just someone who understands that when you get in that hospital room, a lot of times you can be the most intelligent, articulate person, but there is just something about the vulnerability of being unwell in whatever way that is, right? And there's that power dynamic there between the healthcare provider and the patient. So it is wonderful to have someone there with you who, when you can't quite remember everything, you can't remember all that, even if you write, because I'll write stuff down. I go in doctor's office and I pull out my list. Okay, and I'm ready and I'll read everything off. But even there are times when I may miss some stuff. And so it's beautiful to have someone there with you who can ask the difficult questions, because I've had a lot of African-American women will tell me, I just didn't want to say anything to my doctor because they said that I was being difficult, but I was just asking a question about my health, right? And that's your right. It's your body, right? And so it is very helpful if you can have an advocate. And there was a program at the congregation where I'm talking about earlier, serving in healthcare ministry. And one of the things that they had, one of the ministries was, they call it a care ministry, and they would have a list of folk who, whenever someone needed either a ride to the hospital or somebody just to go into the doctor's appointment with them, there was always a list of folk who would be able to go with that person and sit with them or take them to that appointment. So just having troops ready on the ground, right? That is one of the really, really kind of, I think, one of the most simple things that we can do, particularly in our congregations.
Hello. In the melody of this foundation, welcome home. But also, being that did you do your study in Tuskegee, that you other women? And the reason why I say that is because of the situations that have come out of Tuskegee with our men and I am I'm a product of two persons that were from Tuskegee, and I had an uncle who was in the situation, and he's now dead, and now all of his children are dead. None of them went to H. But I give God the praise and the honor. But my question, you already answered basically the question: how can we be advocates for our daughters, our mothers, our females that are going into maternal issues? But my situation is that I have five grandbabies, and every last one of them were difficult pregnancies, and I was there with them, and I tried to be that advocate.
Yes.
And in some cases, I got shut down, and trust me, I didn't like it. But God is good. But at the same token, I have a daughter who's now pregnant again, and I am wanting to be, how far can I go as the advocate? Because I get shut down again, somebody gonna have a problem.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying, and so I may be the wrong person to ask about this, because I'm like, you go as far as you need to go. I'm sorry, all professionalism aside, because that's your baby and them your grandbabies. Just being real. You have to, because see, this is a life or death situation. Like, this is not, we're not out here playing games. This is real, so we have to be about it.
Thank you. Blessing.
Thank you, sis. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Uh-oh.
So, hi, my name is Danielle Farrell from Chicago. First time here.
Can't hear
Can
you.
you hear me now? All right, there we go. I was like, what is going on with this mic? Okay. So I wanted to talk about an incident that I had in December. My best friend and roommate is an amazing blues singer, travels the world. She was about to go out to do a gig, and her hand started hurting.
Okay.
Started burning. We didn't know what it was. We called the EMTs. They come and say she's having a... All right, can you hear me now? Okay,
Yes.
there we go, sorry. Okay, there we go. Alrighty. So, all right. So the EMTs comes to the house. They say she's having a panic attack. The very first thing they say is, "There's no way she could be having a stroke."
Oh,
So we go into the ambulance. She can walk when we're walking in the ambulance. They're asking her all these different questions. You know, have you ever smoked before? And they're like, oh, it might just be the. She's like, I've been doing cannabis for over 20 years. Never had this problem before. They're like, oh, it might just be the cannabis. Don't worry about it, right? Because saying you might not even have to go to the hospital. We get to the hospital, and we aren't able to go back into the emergency room because there's been a shooting and all this, whatever, right? I say all this to say because she has a spinal stroke. She was stroking out for 8 hours
oh,
because they wouldn't listen. She can't walk.
oh my.
Something has to change. This is not okay. And we walked in there. She wasn't fine, but we knew something was wrong.
That's right.
I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help. She's currently in Nebraska, and luckily she's been able to get the feeling in her top back and a little feeling in her legs, and she's able to sing again. But it took so much time. But what are the steps that we can take so this doesn't happen to someone else?
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing, sister. This is an example of, this is one of the reasons why the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had to start a campaign called Hear Her, right? This is an example of why we needed that campaign. And it was to help not just family members and friends and community members, but to help our healthcare professionals to actually just listen. I mean, doesn't it sound so simple? And that's what is most disturbing about this. And now, of course, given all of the chaos since January, I don't even think that campaign is still going. But we don't need the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, right, to carry on that campaign. Because I think we have a Hear Her campaign right here. Okay? So that is one of the things that I really am prayerful that we can mobilize in your communities, in your congregations. Mobilize the foot soldiers. We have our own Hear Her campaign. We can't, because we know that we cannot rely on this regime to do it for us. We can do that for ourselves. Thank you, my sister. Thank you so much.
ready for, to her experience, to the question that preceded it. So I live in Virginia. Around the same time in 2019, I'm going to get to the question. My question is, I was struggling as I was listening to you to find the theological framework that is for this moment. I loved how you offered lament initially, but that's for people who recognize our humanity, which does not exist. And so I was struggling to explore to find what would be the theological framework, and here's the context for that. In 2019, when Black maternal health exploded, I was leading health advocacy and policy at the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. I'm known for writing a bill that became a budget amendment in order to get it passed that provided prenatal care to undocumented women, which does not exist only until they have emergency labor and delivery, emergency Medicaid. I established a maternal health coalition. But during that campaign, when you were talking about sort of what we can do, right, not relying on federal regime, but what can we do in our communities, my mobilization had to shift because during that time between 2019 and 2020, we went from a Democratic governor, which allowed for us, and the coalition is called PUSH, to move forward in a lot of things. Implicit bias bill passed with bipartisan support. It's challenged now with the Republican governor. There's other initiatives now that's challenged, and so while initially we were able to uplift stories like this sister, stories from doulas, stories from the field, to get bills passed, advocacy supported, when the Republicans took over office, we had to shift. And we had to actually focus on policy budgeting. And it's sad, but that is the reality. Our faces and our stories don't matter. We were in line and we're talking about they don't care about us. We know this. But it wasn't until we lifted sort of the fiscal impact, the revenue sharing, the cost sharing that comes to state coffers, we were able to build more support from those who don't recognize humanity, whose our stories would fall flat on. And so that's where the question comes from, because that's the moment, yes, 2020 times 10 right yes. now that we're facing.
Thank you, yes, yes, and that is real. And, you know, it's interesting because for me, my theological framework is definitely lament. In fact, my daughter is so sick of me. She's like, oh, there you go again, talking about lament. But that is just so central to my framework. But it is also, in that framework is this biblical justice, right? This biblical notion of justice, which is fidelity to the demands of a relationship. And so just like you were saying, my sister, problem is that fidelity there's no fidelity to the demands of a relationship, because how it is so hard to be in relationship with folk who don't even acknowledge, right, that humanity. And so then I fall back on the wisdom of my father, who told me, and just like what you were saying, you have to meet folk where they are. So if this is where they are, they're worrying about their pockets, okay, fine, then we need to meet you there, and we will do our best to hit you there, right? And to hit at that in our, you know, if this is how we have to deal with this, that is where we're going to go and deal with it, right? And that is problematic, yes, because we wish we really could appeal to the sensitivities of folk. Because if these folk are saying, you know, claiming that they are, you know, Christian, then you should understand biblical justice is about fidelity to the demands of a relationship. Relationship with God, with one another, with creation, you know, right? But it's clear that that's not where we are. So you're doing what you have to do in that sense, right? meeting them where they are. It's unfortunate, but that is, yeah, that is the reality.
Good afternoon. My name is Kenya Murray Morris, and I just first wanted to begin with saying thank you for your scholarly work. I struggled with standing up here today, but I just wanted to lead with one of the names that you called into the space, one of the preventable deaths for Black maternal health, Dr. Shalon Irving, was my colleague. As an early scientist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Shalon Irving was a mentor to many of us. And she encouraged me to go back to school and get a PhD. And it took 10 years between my master's and my PhD, but in that time period, I grew deeper in my understanding of the needs of Black women, not only in this country, but also in other spaces as well. And so I have a two-part question. One is a model of care question, and the other one is to support me in my own growing and learning. The model of care question, and so in thinking about data, so my profession, I work as a scientist. I'm an epidemiologist like Dr. Shalon Irving. And I study morbidity and mortality amongst women, infant, and children. I'm currently dissertating. I'm in my dissertation stage where I'm looking at, similar to what the sister here shared, I'm looking at preventable deaths due to stroke and heart attack amongst reproductive age women. And my question is, in thinking about the Black maternal health crisis, I think people assume that it's the actual childbirthing process where deaths happen. But according to the data, it's the postpartum period. Day one, up until day 365, where over half of women are dying. And that differs by race. Black women mainly die closer to that 1 year period. But legally in this country, 1 to 6 weeks is considered postpartum. So we're missing Black women further on down the line.
That's right.
I think about historically, I've had the privilege of living on a compound, working with women, infant, and children in Zambia, comparing models of care in sub-Saharan Africa to also models of care here in the US. What historical models of care did we use in the past, ancestrally, to keep ourselves safe? And also what's driving that question, thinking about the erasure of Black midwives in the birthing experience. So what models of care are available to us now that we should be advocating for?
Yes.
The other question is a data question. It rolls off of our tongues that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die. People could recite that statistic front and back. My question is always around what's the quality of experience behind the human who is that data point. What methods should we be advocating for? I come from a quantitative background, but I'm now at the point where I'm adding mixed methodologies to my work to interrogate the quantitative data point, to get the stories. But my question is, what should I be advocating for in terms of my methodologies as an epidemiologist as I stand behind this work, watching those deaths occur year after year, day after day?
That's right.
Long question, but thank you.
Okay. Thank you, my sister. Thank you so much. So yes, so the main, okay, first to your first question. So the main model of care that I focused on in my research was around, of course, midwifery and doulas, and particularly because of, one, the history of midwives and the significance of that for African American women, right? And how midwives were, this was earlier in our history, were demonized, you know, because of course, obstetricians at the time were all predominantly white men. And here are these women of color, right, who they were saying, these are backwards women, they're uneducated, you know, they're the reason why birth mortality is so high and whatnot. But but the reality is that the birth rate it's not the fault of the midwives. It was actually women were doing better and had better outcomes under the midwives than they did before this whole medicalization of birth and falling under the birthing men, as they were called back then. So the advocacy around, midwives and doulas, because I had a particular experience of my own when I was pregnant with my own child. We were living in a state where it was illegal to have a doula, right? And I wanted a doula. I needed a doula. I'm a black woman. And, so just seeing, what's going on where you are, right? Seeing if these policies are in place that either help or inhibit women's access to birth workers, because that is really important, and it's really been a significant source of social support and care for marginalized women. So that's first things first. To your second question, I'm so glad you're doing mixed methods, because one of the things that is really important, we're not working anymore. She's now graduated, thank you, Lord. One of my former students who graduated, she was in the School of Public Health at UNC, and so she wanted me to be on her committee because she was like, look, I'm doing all of this quantitative work. She said, but I really want to get at the women behind these numbers. And so what she did is she actually did the qualitative interviews. And so she sat with the women and heard their stories, and it really ended up being really powerful. So if you are able to, I know that adds a lot of time. I mean, heck, I was out in the field for like 18 months. So it took me almost 10 years to get my whole, my degree as well. But it took a long time, but it was absolutely worth it, right? Like that little extra time, like I don't even think about all the time it took now, right? Because that extra time, being out in the field, hearing the stories of folk in the community and their experiences, I would not trade that for anything. And that's actually, and that even is a part of what makes my whole experience and the writing of the book, everything, it made all of that really powerful, and it just was helpful for me and for the community, because the community needs to know, they need to know you have credibility when you come in, with your research. And so I think that is really, if you're able to do that, I would really advocate you doing that. And there are sources of funding for that, and we could talk about that, but there are sources of funding that you can have access to help you with having funds when you're out there trying to do the qualitative data collection.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Wilson.